Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jim Chandler, the director of the Franke Institute for the Humanities, which is the sponsor of this series, along with the Humanities Division at the University of Chicago. The series is a quarterly lecture here at the Gleacher Center, whose purpose is to enable faculty from the University of Chicago to share their work in a more public setting and for a more diverse kind of audience than we sometimes have down at the university. And it's been running now for a long time, 18, 19 years we've been doing this. We have both of the remaining lectures for the year scheduled now. This one comes very early in the autumn quarter, and the next one comes late in the winter quarter, so it's a long way off, but it'll be worth waiting for. It's Jeffrey Stone, who in March will be publishing his book on law and sexuality, the long history of law and sexuality that he's been working on for a number of years. He'll be talking to us about Sex and the Constitution, The Road to Roe. That'll be on March 1st. And on May 10th, Darby English from the Art and History Department will be talking about painters and the police. So something else to put on your calendars. I'm very delighted that we have Patrick Jagoda to speak to us today, and to introduce him properly, I give you my colleague in English and the Department of Visual Arts, Bill Brown, who is the Carla Scherer Distinguished Service Professor in American Culture at the University of Chicago. Bill?
So this is a real pleasure for me. I thought I could do this off the cuff, but then I realized that I was just leaving a classroom, and I thought, ooh, better write something down, But I didn't write down, but what I really remember is the first time I started reading Patrick's work, which was when I was chairing a search committee within the English department in new media. And I can remember Patrick's file being so outstanding in relation to the rest of the files that it became clear that if we couldn't hire this guy, we could hire no one, right? So the really good news was that he came to Chicago. The better news is that he's been terrific. I now have him co-chairing a media arts and design committee in the provost's office, and that's the kind of work that Patrick does all the time. He is the author of Network Aesthetics, Chicago 2016. It's a book that tracks the network as fact and as figure in the 20th and 21st centuries. As he says in the opening pages of the book, connection has become the infrastructural basis of everyday life. That's a life all of us lead. But there is, as he goes on to say, an evolving and dynamic relation with that infrastructure, a network imaginary, a term by which he means to caption a complex of material infrastructures and metaphorical figures that shape our experience, cognitive, bodily, affective, and in particular, our experience of the social world. So the network as fact and as figure, like when you say, oh, you're going to go network, at such and such a conference, for instance. What are the formal features of this imaginary? That is the question that this book asks. Attuned as he is to the field of cybernetics emerging after World War II, as to the fields of information and communication, as to the arrival of the internet and the World Wide Web, Patrick locates his inquiry in really intense engagements with cultural works, maximalist novels, that is really, really long contemporary novels, films, television series, and games, all of which teach us something about the network imaginary we cannot help but inhabit. These works include things like Don DeLillo's Underworld and David Simon's The Wire. And Patrick is a wonderfully patient and persistent reader, and does a great job of sensing how the formal logic of the network challenges, interrupts, or expands the inherited formal logic or logics of particular genre and media. The second half of the book turns to the formal and ethnographic study of games, video games, internet games, and alternate reality games, that is, ARGs, that rely on participatory social networks. And those games include The Project, an ARG that Patrick himself designed, a kind of mystery game enabling the constitution of different player communities to explore the three conspiracy groups with online and offline dimensions. He did this in collaboration with the media artist Xia Zheng Wei and the Montreal-based Topological Media Lab and a host of University of Chicago students, graduate and undergraduate. So it's also, with Patrick, it often takes a network to think about these things and to build these things. The book is an interdisciplinary and multimedia tour de force, already much admired and much cited. He is also the author of The Game Worlds of Jason Rohrer, composed with the game designer Rohrer, co-editor of New Media and American Literature, and co-editor of Comics and Media, a special issue of Critical Inquiry in 2014. That, I say, as one of the co-editors of Critical Inquiry, has, I think, already become our most popular special issue ever. He is the author of more than 20 articles in several multimedia publications, and if you Google, for instance, Patrick Jagoda projects, like another 20 items come up, conferences and collaborations, one-time alternate reality games, really an extraordinary range of intellectual and artistic platforms. At the university, Patrick is, I think, probably best known as the co-founder with Melissa Gilliam, a professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics, co-founder of Game Changer Chicago Design Lab, devoted to creating youth-directed and problem-based digital stories to explore such issues as sexual and reproductive health. In March of 2015, the MacArthur Foundation awarded Game Changer a $1 million grant to support work at the lab, testifying to the widespread recognition of the novelty and the significance of that project. Patrick really is, I think, changing the university. So I want to close back to this hiring moment. Miriam Hansen, my late colleague in English and Cinema Media Studies, and Tom Mitchell, and I had Patrick for dinner, as one does, right? And it was an English department, so talking to Patrick, he was talking about Pynchon and Don DeLillo and David Foster Wallace, and finally I said, Patrick, I said, all these novels, we got people who teach novels. We need to know more about the new media stuff. Tell us, like, the coolest thing you're doing in that realm. And he said, well, right now I'm teaching a class, and it's a virtual classroom, and the students come as avatars. And so if you're, for instance, a slight young woman, you can come as a buff guy who works out. And if you're a big guy, you can come as a small female dinosaur. And the three of us were like, okay, that's what we want. And so Patrick, I fear today, is coming only as himself, but please welcome him with me.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bill. It's wonderful to get to work with Bill and Jim, from whom I've learned so much. I can only teach you about small female dinosaurs, but maybe a little bit more in this talk. Thank you, Mai and Bertie, for setting all of this up as well. So as a warning, this is going to be a kind of hybrid talk that is somewhere between a humanities lecture, a public health presentation, and an artist talk. And I'll be moving through a large number of images. So to start off, why do games matter in 2016? Well, video games have become an immensely popular medium, and some estimates put them right now at roughly $90 billion a year. Just to give you a couple of examples, when Rockstar Games' Grand Theft Auto 5 came out in September 2013, it grossed $1 billion in its first 3 days. Making it the fastest growing work of entertainment in history, beating out every film or musical recording. More recently, as you may have heard, Pokemon Go became a phenomenon. It became the #1 selling app or game on the US sales charts within 13 hours. As of September 30th, about 1 week ago, it had been downloaded 550 million times worldwide. And players spend not only considerable money, but also substantial time with contemporary games. So Activision, a video game company, announced that the players of its hit game Call of Duty Black Ops logged 600 million hours of the game in the first 45 days of its release. So that's the equivalent of 68,000 years of gameplay compressed into 45 days. So these numbers are totally astonishing, and I don't throw them out merely in the service of spectacle worship or cowering before the capitalist sublime. I throw them out to suggest that we may now be in what game designer Eric Zimmerman calls the ludic century. In other words, the 21st century so far has made video games as central as a cultural form as cinema once was in the 20th century. And it still, may seem odd that I do my scholarly work on video games, especially given that I'm at the University of Chicago, where, of course, fun comes to die. And yet, game studies has become a really central field in the humanities. And we do close readings of video games in the way that we do with poetry, novels, cinema. And in a more practical register, I'm also interested in what the form of video games means and what its unexplored affordances might be, given how much attention it receives. I'm especially interested in what Clark Apt in 1970 called serious games. So he defined serious games or applied games as games designed for a primary purpose other than pure entertainment. He also said that serious games for him evolved out of my dual fascination with scientific problem solving on the one hand and dramatic human conflicts on the other, with science and the humanities and how to combine them. And that's precisely what interests me, is this intersection between the humanities and the sciences that games represent. Most of Clark Apt's games were analog. He made role-playing games and card games. But since the 1970s, serious or applied games have grown, especially in the United States. And it's important to stress that the centrality of games has also exceeded the realm of gamers through a phenomenon called gamification. And gamification is a term that derives from behavioral economics and refers to the use of game mechanics in traditionally non-game activities. So it's a buzzword that emerged in the early 21st century, but has already found its way into business, marketing, psychology, and design. And we see countless examples of this sort of thing. So for instance, there's a website called Chore Wars that converts undesirable household tasks into a game. So you receive points, you level up, you do the things that you would in a game in exchange for doing household tasks. We have apps like Foursquare. We have training games for employees like Exonify. And there's a great deal of writing, especially in business and psychology, that talks about the ways that gamification works to motivate people to perform tasks they might otherwise not want to perform. So gamification uses elements of games to confront these everyday issues, but we've also seen the rise of video games that take on serious social and political issues themselves. And these games aren't necessarily direct extensions of behaviorism. They're not necessarily trying to change attitudes and behaviors. They're not about the quantified self in the same way that gamification is. But they cover a whole host of topics. So now we have, going from the top left over, games about surgery, neocolonialism, transnational labor markets. On the bottom row, we have games about ecology, Israel and Palestine, so a kind of political simulation, and games about the conflict in Darfur. And this is just a small fraction of the existing games that are deemed serious. We also have games that are analog. So there are board games and card games that have to do with topics like medical training or teaching young people how to apply to college, for instance. There's also an emerging literature, it's not great yet, it's growing, about how effective games may be in the realm of education. So thus far there's some suggestive research showing that games depend on a visceral or an emotional logic, that they garner curiosity, motivation, effort, and optimism about the possibility of completing a challenge, that they activate multiple learning styles, right? When I'm speaking at you now, there's essentially one channel of information, language, maybe a second if there are images. Games include text, audio, animation, participatory modes, networked modes, so they meet learners where they are in a number of different places. Also, games promote social and interpersonal learning. We oftentimes have this image of gamers being young adolescent boys who are sitting in a basement playing by themselves. In fact, that's not the case, and I'll show you some numbers later suggesting this. Games are fundamentally social. Games also enable safe failure and resilience. I like to argue that games are the only place in American culture where you're allowed to fail and you don't have to pay the consequences. It's a space to move through trial and error and attempt different things. And finally, they encourage systems learning. Many of the games that I mentioned before, the game about Israel and Palestine, for instance, create connections between individuals and larger economic or political systems. So then this leads me to a question. For a game designer like me, how do you create a game that's capable of changing attitudes and behaviors about serious topics if there are these kinds of learning benefits? There are a few challenges to this kind of thing. So many of the educational games that you might be familiar with, like Math Blaster or Reader Rabbit from the 1980s, look a lot like interactive quizzes. They're not very engaging games. They take, what one might think of as the chocolate-covered broccoli approach to game design. So you take information that might be boring to some people, you put it within the shell of something that is allegedly engaging, i.e. a game, and you claim to offer a compelling learning tool on the other end. Of course, that's not the way that it usually works, and these games often fail to engage students. There are at least 3 reasons that I'll throw out for this, why these kinds of games don't hit their mark. First of all, games with direct learning content may trigger psychological defenses and reduce player engagement. They may seem too didactic. I see this all the time when we play test some of our early versions of games. Second of all, psychological research suggests that being better informed doesn't necessarily lead to beneficial outcomes. For instance, there was a study by Robert Cialdini that demonstrated that making the prevalence of undesirable behaviors like littering more salient to individuals sometimes increases their likelihood of committing the same action. So such prohibitions can promote the desire to transgress or make an undesirable action like littering seem more common and therefore more acceptable. And then third of all, information-focused environments can yield less engagement. So there's a study by Rosalind Picard and some researchers at MIT Media Labs where they suggest that information-focused environments lead to less engagement. So they gave a bunch of students wrist sensors that measured skin conductance as an index of the arousal associated with emotion, cognition, and attention. So basically these sensors showed when students were awake, alert, and attentive. And the sensor recorded strong spikes of attention during activities like study, lab work, and homework, but they essentially flatlined in 2 activities. The first activity was watching TV. I can say that's true from experience. And the second activity very regularly was going to lecture. So essentially for current students, having raw information thrown at them is not always the most effective way of teaching, which is why some of these games aren't as effective as we might want them to be. So Geoff Kaufman, who I believe is a psychologist, and Mary Flanagan, who's a game designer, have proposed an alternative approach to game design that they call embedded learning. And they've done randomized control trials on 2 of their games that used elements of embedded learning. And they found that serious pro-social and learning games can be more effective if they're less overt and less obviously didactic. They also come up with a series of design methods, and I'll talk about 2 or 3 of these briefly, that are supposed to help one get around this kind of didactic approach. They call these intermixing, obfuscating, psychological distancing, embodied cognition, priming, strategic inversion, and delayed reveal. So one of Kaufman and Flanagan's design concepts is intermixing, and this is combining on-topic and off-topic game content to make the focal message or theme less obvious and more accessible. So their case study for this concept is a game called Awkward Moment, which is a kind of apples-to-apples style party game about gender bias in STEM fields. And they found that participants who played a version of this game that embedded gender bias scenarios alongside ordinary awkward moments showed a much stronger anti-bias response compared to participants who played a more didactic version of the game. A second concept is obfuscation. So this involves using game genres or framing devices that direct players' attention or expectations away from the game's true aims. So they have this card game called Buffalo, the name-dropping game, which is a game about social identity and inherent bias. And this game, again, is built to divert the player's attention from its ultimate message. Again, they did a series of studies. It suggested that this was more effective than a game that the students knew was trying to teach them something. A third design concept that they don't talk so much about is something they call strategic inversion. And this involves the deployment of irony or satire to represent desired themes or topics in subversive ways. So I'll use an example that we created in my lab, a board game called Smokestacks. And this was an anti-smoking game for adolescents. So basically in this game, you play as a tobacco company. You play against other people who represent tobacco companies, and you try to get as many people addicted to your product as you possibly can. And in the process, you pick up a media strategy, a medium, so there's this kind of media studies education component to it. But as you start playing the game, you realize that you, as an actual person, aren't like these tobacco companies at all. You're much more likely to be the target of these kinds of strategies. So it uses this process of strategic inversion and uses a medium-specific form of procedural rhetoric to teach players through gameplay actions. So anyway, the larger point that I'm trying to make is that it's important to meet a student or a learner where they are. And this benefits from using embedded design techniques of the sort that Flanagan and Kaufman are suggesting. But it also raises larger questions about audience and context. In game design, it's important to begin not merely with theory, but with on-the-ground practice. So what do people desire? How do people actually move across, say, an architectural space or a new technology? What might a user experience of a game be like? So we have a number of techniques that help us ask these kinds of questions early so as not to waste time and money. These are user-centered design, human-centered design, something called environmental design, which comes from architecture, and experience design, which is specific to the way that we create games and game-like experiences. When we think about context, we need to think centrally about audience, who's playing a particular kind of game. And context becomes really, really important. There's still this assumption that games are played primarily by adolescent boys, and it's just not true. So the Entertainment Software Association did a survey in which they found that the average age of video game players in America is 37. Also, 42% of American gamers are women. And on top of this, there are significant variations internationally between the kinds of genres that are preferred in different countries. So say the United States versus South Korea versus Scandinavian countries. There's no homogeneity in the market in the way that there might have been in the 1970s or the 1980s. So what I want to do with the last part of this talk is to turn to my own work at the Game Changer Chicago Design Lab. And so this is a lab that I started with Melissa Gilliam, as Bill said before the talk. She's a professor in medicine and public health, and together we created this lab. Just to contextualize this a little bit, our mission is to create and study scalable, creative, transdisciplinary, and youth-facing games that draw from participatory culture and promote adolescent health. It's a mouthful, so I'll break that down a little bit as I go. But basically, we're interested in this connection between games and education that I already talked about. But we're also interested in the connection between education and health. So public health issues like teen pregnancy, for instance, stem from structural inequalities in the lives of disadvantaged young people. And Melissa's research over the last decade has really delved into this topic. So by structural inequalities, I mean poverty, unsafe neighborhoods, low-quality healthcare, underperforming schools, transportation difficulties, minimal access to healthy foods, and lack of guarantees of personal safety. And research on minority stress perspectives demonstrates that continuous exposure to uncertainty and insecurity as a result of these structural factors leads to chronic stressors that undermine resilience and ultimately lead to poor health. So we're dealing with health, but we're coming at it indirectly through education and these other kinds of structural issues. And our work is not based exclusively in Chicago, but we are based on the south side of Chicago. And that context constantly reminds us that Chicago is still a segregated city, and a few minutes apart one finds great wealth and notable poverty. So we're trying to address health in a city. If we're trying to address health in a city like this, questions of context become really important. Of course, we can't take on all health issues in an urban area, so we're committed to a particular audience. We're mostly working with adolescents between the ages of 13 and 21. Many of the youth with whom we work are African American and Latino. As such, context becomes really important in our games. I'm talking about cultural context, economic context, geographical context. To face some of these issues, we have a very diverse team. So this is just a small fraction of the team that's part of the CI3 Center, of which the Game Lab is a part. So we have people coming from backgrounds in medicine, psychology, game design, literary theory in my case, creative writing, theater, digital media, youth activism, and education, just to name a few. This team has taken us years to assemble. It includes graduate students, undergraduates. It's really cross-generational, and I think that's part of its strength, when there is a strength. This is our method. So one of the things that we're trying to do that's very different from other labs is we're trying to move through the entire process of a game. So early on in the planning stage, we begin with thorough lit reviews. We bring in advisory groups that are made of the kind of audience that we want to target with any given game, and put them through all kinds of exercises. Once we get to the design process, we prototype a game, test that prototype, integrate whatever feedback we get from the test, and iterate that process. This circle of making goes around many times before we come up with something that's ready to move out. On the other end, we study these games. I mean, we try to do, I'll say more about this, but we try to do rigorous research to evaluate whether they're effective, how they're ineffective in some cases. I mean, we really try to think about our failures as well. And the last piece of this is we're really trying to distribute these games. So people like Dan Obie in the audience are helping us now circulate, distribute these games, see how many students we can actually get them in front of, and whether we can use those games then to change laws, change policies. That at least is the long-term goal with this kind of work. For the research we do, and I'm coming from the humanities, so all of this was steep learning curve over the last few years. We use qualitative methods, baseline surveys, interviews, focus groups, and things like ethnography. And when I'm writing papers for humanities journals, in which we also publish, I'm really drawing on a lot of the stuff that I was trained in. So close reading, for instance, or critical theory come into a lot of this writing, actually. So we'll publish in journals like Sex Education, but also humanities journals like the American Journal of Play. Differences was a journal that we published in recently. We also are lucky enough to have support from many different places, certainly federal funders like the NIH and the NSF, but also places like the MacArthur Foundation. What all of this produces is a range of different games. And I'll just show you a couple of quick examples. We've created a card game about sexually transmitted infections for a high school sex ed curriculum. This game is called Infection 4. Smokestacks, I already mentioned, the anti-smoking board game. We created a board called Hexacago, which is a map of the city of Chicago with hexagons overlaying it. And we've created 5 or 6 games on this one board. We've also used this board as an educational suite where we bring in high school students, we bring in undergraduates sometimes, and we have them design games about, say, gang violence or water shortage using the same board. And we found that becoming a game designer, not just a game player, can be a really wonderful way of thinking about systems issues. One prototype that we're working on right now is a mobile game, a digital game called The Test. And this is kind of, I didn't even mean this pun, but it's kind of been a test on our process because we've had to complete a prototype in a mere 3 months with a team of about 4 people. But this is a game about promoting HIV testing, specifically among African American men who have sex with men. This is based on all kinds of research. There's a need for these kinds of testing tools. And so we use all kinds of procedural interactive metaphors to try to convey some of the reasons people don't get tested and try to change some attitudes about why testing is a good idea. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to do with this talk is move through 2 cases in a slightly more detailed way, just to give you a sense of what a finished game might look like. And these are games that we're still moving through research on, but the design has been largely completed. So the first game is a game called Bystander, which is a sexual violence prevention game and program that's aimed at 14 to 18-year-olds. And it's meant to combat attitudes and behaviors that can contribute to harassment and sexual violence among adolescents. And these statistics I wish I didn't have to show you, but in 2013, 14.4% of girls and 6.2% of boys attending U.S. High schools reported they experienced sexual dating violence and rape. During the 2010-2011 school year, 48% of students experienced sexual harassment. So what we've done basically is turn to the bystander strategy to confront some of these things. It's not the only way to do it. I think it's part of a larger possible curriculum. But basically it's a community level approach to try to get bystanders involved in preventing sexual assault. The game itself is narrative-based. It's comprised of 4 interactive lessons and an accompanying curriculum. It covers topics of sexual harassment, supporting assault survivors, consent, laws around sexual violence, accessing resources and bystander behaviors. And it's designed using the theory of planned behavior to positively impact the knowledge, attitudes, subjective norms, and behavioral intention around bystander behaviors and sexual violence prevention. To give you a sense of some of the graphics in this game, so in episode 1, the player navigates a high school environment identifying instances of sexual harassment, sexual aggression. In a second episode, a friend reveals to you that she was sexually assaulted. And basically, you have to listen to her and make dialogue choices. Episode 3, the player is at a friend's party witnessing an acquaintance sexually coerce a friend using alcohol, so it deals with kind of alcohol and different kinds of rape myths. And then fourth of all, a male friend relates a sexual assault by older teenagers and is unsure of what to do next, and you basically use your phone, a representation of your phone, to find information to help that person. So the game was designed with Chicago South Side youth in mind. As such, the game departs from many norms of the mainstream video game industry. For instance, most of our characters are black youth who inhabit the types of schools and neighborhoods that these young people inhabit. And all of our stories were discussed and workshopped with youth from the community. This game doesn't use quite as much embedded design, but it does have off-topic narrative components that try to move the learner's attention to many different places. The second case study that I'm going to talk about is very different. So this is something called an alternate reality game, as Bill was saying, or a mixed reality game, we could call it as well. And this one was meant to intervene in STEM. So this was an odd thing for me to be coming to as somebody from the humanities. And we're usually expected to be like pitted up against science, technology, engineering, and math, given the two cultures model. But this was an interesting project in which the humanities and arts were being used in order to expand the field of who could study STEM. So according to the National Science Foundation, in the US, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans earn fewer than 15% of undergraduate degrees in engineering, math, and the physical sciences. Similarly, in 2009, women represented only 18% of engineering undergraduates. And the lack of racial, ethnic, and gender diversity among those pursuing STEM education and careers produces representational imbalances, decreases job opportunities for underrepresented population, and narrows the possibility of innovation across theoretical and applied sciences. So right now, certainly there are STEM classes in school, but there are also a number of studies that suggest that out-of-school learning may be the better way to get creative about the ways in which different kinds of learners can enter into STEM careers. So we did something not only creative but kind of crazy, which is we created something called an alternate reality game to grapple with this topic. So out of curiosity, how many of you in the audience have heard about this genre before? Okay, so maybe a third or a quarter. So I'll give you a very quick rundown, and these are some of the other terms that get used sometimes to describe alternate reality games. I personally like search operas, but it never caught on. So alternate reality games can be understood provisionally as heavily mediated and narrative-driven scavenger hunts that unfold in physical space and online and have very large collectives of players. So they have at least 4 qualities. First of all, they're experienced across multiple media, across text, video, audio, phone calls, email, code-breaking puzzles, social media, and theatrical performance. They're not based on a single screen, right? You're moving in a fragmented way from medium to medium. Second of all, the stories are broken into discrete pieces that players must rediscover and reconfigure. Third of all, player networks are participatory and collective. They're never single-player games. And fourth of all, they have something called a "this is not a game" aesthetic. Basically, you never announced officially that the participants are taking part in a game. They have to figure this out through context. They fall into what are called rabbit holes. So they might receive an email from one of the characters, or they may get a social media invitation from one of the characters, and that way find their way into the game. So this term rabbit hole comes from Alice in Wonderland and suggests falling into this kind of alternate reality. So for this game, we surveyed 69 players, slightly fewer than the overall participant base. We were working with adolescents. These are just some of the demographic numbers. And just to give you a sense, youth came to campus daily for 5 weeks to play this game. Again, we used a lot of the same research methods that I mentioned before: surveys, focus groups, interviews, looked at game assets that young people were creating during the experience. And our objectives were to develop new media literacies for the participants, to transmit STEM knowledge and career interest, and finally to promote political participation and civic engagement. Okay, so now the humanities part. How did we get them to play this game? How did we use artful narrative and framing to get them interested in what might have been, not the most interesting way to spend 5 weeks during the summer. We created a science fiction frame. And on the first day of the program, we gave them a letter that said this. And I'm going to read the entire letter because I think it's important to the frame. A message from Project Harvest. Welcome to Project Harvest. We are a global research group commissioned by the Profile Corporation and mediated by the Temporal Archivists. We do not yet exist in your world, but we have something important to tell you. In the near future, Project Harvest has determined that the end of the world was initiated on July 25th, 2014, so we're okay. And that it started in the city of Chicago. Using C technology, we have now been able to reach you. Our capacity for time communication is limited, and we must be careful not to reveal things that may alter the future irrevocably or even stop it from unfolding. We are contacting you at a historical moment in which we have determined the end of the world might still be prevented. In the second half, you are part of a crop that has been initiated through advanced scientific methods of fractal statistical analysis and individual profiling. You are our only hope for changing the future. Everything is still up for grabs. There are only two certainties. First, each of you has the possibility of being a hero and saving the future. Second, one of you will cause the end of the world. From here, we must proceed with great care. You will receive your next instruction in just a few hours. You will then have 15 days to find the person among you who has come to be known in the 2030s as the world's end. We need your help. The survival of the world depends on it. Okay, so a little bit cheesy, but two things that this accomplished. First of all, it interpolated the players as protagonists in this long-form narrative. Second of all, it created a feeling of critical paranoia that readers of Thomas Pynchon, for instance, might know very well, in which the players were constantly looking at one another and trying to figure out, who among them might initiate the end of the world. The best way that I can show you what this game felt like is to show you a short 2-minute video. Unfortunately, I'm in it. I don't have any alternative video to show you. But the point is more to show you what the kind of mise-en-scène, the set design, and the kind of technological components looked like. So I'm going to just play this for you. Seed was an alternate reality game, or ARG. And an alternate reality game is essentially a narrative-driven scavenger hunt in which players role-play and solve puzzles across media. Students came in and operated as players, and then after that experience, we asked them to become game designers for 2 weeks. And for 2 weeks, they were making their own games about a variety of social justice and civic engagement issues. We told youth that the world was going to end in 3 weeks, and only two things were certain. First, they could save the world in those 3 weeks, and second of all, one of them was going to cause the end of the world. And we created a kind of time travel narrative in which they were in communication with a group from the future called Profile, a corporation that was sending them little bits of information about the coming apocalypse and was purportedly helping them stop this. One of our priorities with the summer camp was to bring youth to the University of Chicago campus and expose them to health professionals, to university faculty, and to undergraduate and graduate students who could serve as mentors for them. A number of our games were designed around the campus. So one example was an iPad-based scavenger hunt that was called DOS, and then moved youth across the University of Chicago campus. And in each location, there were cryptographic puzzles and information-based challenges that they had to solve in order to move through the game. We also find that gameplay and game design both speak to what we call 21st century literacies. So these include cognitive skills like critical thinking, interpersonal skills like organization, and then interpersonal skills like collaboration, teamwork, and leadership.
Project C, I'd say, is an amazing thing that teens could just do during summer or doing whenever. Like me going into my junior year, this was a good step for me, learning about game design and learning about these topics, because you need to know about these in order to get to college and go into the real world.
Okay, so just to finish up, So students came to the campus 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. for these 5 weeks. The main characters of the game wore lab coats the entire time, and just to show you that I wasn't abusing my graduate students, I was also wearing a lab coat for those 3 weeks. This is a bonus of transdisciplinary research, is sometimes you get to change your outfit for a few weeks. The basic curriculum had to do, so the first week we focused on different apocalyptic scenarios, things like climate change, superviruses, resource depletion, and had them engage in competitive debates around these topics. In the second week, we had this Power Spots game that I mentioned that dealt with different issues of mathematics and cryptography. And in the third week, we had them essentially become hackers and develop some computer literacy through these genres that they knew, through cyberpunk and science fiction and things like that. So to conclude, these serious game experiments, which I'm happy to speak more about, have taught us a few things. So first of all, the importance of embedded design, so the importance of integrating lessons into engaging narratives and gameplay. Second of all, the importance of context, so it's key to take into account where players are coming from. Third of all, focusing on appropriate game mechanics. So in Bystander, we incorporated game mechanics and actions that would allow students to practice bystander intervention skills, including listening to survivor and paying attention at a party at which people are drinking heavily. And then fourth of all, matching learning objectives and game genres. So with Bystander, we decided on a single-player game, in part because sexual violence is a difficult topic to discuss. And with Seed, we created a collective and a social game because of the importance of creating communities for underrepresented students in STEM. We also chose the genre of alternate reality games because it allowed us more space for improvisation and adjustment than a standard video game could do. We weren't working with seasoned STEM students or ARG players, so we needed to be as responsive as possible. Truly, to conclude, I think games are such an important cultural form to study and experiment with because they promote a radically transdisciplinary way of working in which humanists and artists, scientists and designers can work together to grapple with major social issues. To prepare for game construction, you need people with interview and intervention skills coming from education, from human-centered design. To create a game, you need writers, graphics people, sound designers, experience designers, media producers, and developers coming from computer science. To study a game, you need researchers from the social sciences, fields like psychology, public health, and education. And to distribute a game and explore its impact, you need folks coming from media studies, business, and policy. If nothing else, serious game design represents an excuse to bring people from all of these different fields to the same table and encourages them to collaborate on shared projects. Thanks.